Hi, I'm the Octopus Lady, you're watching Alien Ocean, and let's talk about geoducks again today, shall we? So this is the second part of my little series on geoducks. If you haven't watched the first one, you should go check it out over here. But just to remind the class where we left off, I ended my last video talking about how I got tossed into a sarlacc pit of research when I learned that these clams were sometimes used to buy drugs. And it all started with this article from Seattle Times reporter Craig Welch titled "The Great Geoduck Caper," which detailed some of the shady criminal activities that were happening as a result of this clam. For example, someone almost getting their legs broken by a hitman. And I actually got that wrong. Something much worse could have happened to that guy, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. Anyway, I thought I had enough time to summarize this article in my last video, but then I found out this Welch guy wrote a whole book about the black market world of geoducks and other wildlife, but mostly geoducks, called Shell Games. And as soon as I found it, I was like, well, this is getting its own video. All this to say, a lot of my research about this topic came from Shell Games. And while this book is part of the true crime genre, a genre I usually don't like at all, I found it very enjoyable. So if you'd like to get a copy yourself, I've put a link in the description where you can buy it. I am not at all sponsored by Craig Welch or his publisher, but he clearly put in absurd amounts of work to write this book, so I just want to make sure he gets the recognition he deserves. Okay, so we're here to answer the question, why? Why did geoducks cause such pandemonium? It all started back in the 1970s. There were some fishermen from around Puget Sound in Washington state who were trying to make geoducks a viable product on the seafood market, but were failing miserably. And I say fishermen, but picture scuba divers, not like, you know, fishermen. As you all know, because you've all been good students and watched my previous video, geoducks are infaunal animals, which means they spend their lives buried deep underground. So you can't catch geoducks with a fishing line and hook or with a net. You actually gotta don some scuba gear and go dig them up yourself. And you can, if you want, wait until low tide to harvest geoducks, because there are geoduck beds that get exposed to air when the tide gets low enough in Puget Sound. But if you're trying to harvest these on a commercial level, you ain't got time to wait for low tide. Anyway, those fishermen, bless their hearts, kept trying to convince Americans to eat these clams, but were not succeeding. The best they could do was sell them to local restaurants for a few cents a pound, who would promptly chuck them into chowders. But things started to change in the 1980s. Asian American and Asian Canadian seafood brokers started shipping geoducks across the Pacific, where they'd be sold in fancy upscale restaurants. And by the 90s, geoducks had exploded in popularity, becoming the new hit seafood sensation in Asia, and suddenly, these clams went from being worth a few cents a pound to a lot more than that. Geoduck harvesting became a gold rush. A geoduck rush. Nailed it. There were estimated to be tens of millions of these clams in Puget Sound, and people were practically throwing themselves into the water, hoping to strike it rich. However, you couldn't just harvest geoducks willy-nilly. Puget Sound was partially managed by the Washington state government, and they had regulations in place to protect the clams, which included only allowing geoduck fishing in specified areas. And competition over these legally fishable areas became cutthroat real quick.
Within open fishing grounds, divers jockey for position, often arguing over who gets to work the best geoduck beds. The disputes led to arguments and fistfights and conflicts among boat captains. One crew even tried to bean rivals by chipping golf balls off their boat's deck.
So legitimate geoduck harvesting was already becoming a bit of a chaotic and dangerous mess, and single 3-pound geoducks were being sold for $60 to $100 USD in Asia. And again, this was all happening in the 90s, so that's equal to $120 to $200 today, and plenty of fishermen knew that there were lots of geoducks in Puget Sound that no one was touching, so it's not hard to figure out what happens next, right? Geoduck poaching immediately goes off the rails. Now, when I say poaching, I'm not talking about like cooking something in gently simmering water. I'm talking about the act of illegally collecting, trafficking, and or killing wildlife. And this was another rabbit hole I unexpectedly fell into, the rabbit hole of wildlife crime. And I can't get into everything I learned there, but I will briefly talk about two things. Firstly, if you were like me before I started researching this video, you thought that wildlife black markets sold mostly things like parts of large exotic animals like elephant tusks or shark fins, or just exotic animals themselves like baby lions or macaws. And while all of that still happens, that's kind of the old school way of thinking about wildlife trafficking.
By the close of the 20th century, a new reality was emerging. Almost anything in nature can become contraband. Fish eggs, baboon noses, decorative seed plants known as cycads, which have been around since the Jurassic period. Venus flytraps snatched illegally from backwoods bogs in the Carolinas land in stalls at open-air Dutch floral markets. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegally caught finger-sized glass eels work their way from New England to Japan. Crooks ship stolen monkey blood through Memphis and ban seal oil through Louisville. Illicit fish, plants, and animals of all varieties crisscross the globe to feed black markets.
Secondly, and this blew my mind when I found this out, according to the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES, if you don't want to say all that, between the years of 1997 and 2016, the illegal wildlife trade was estimated to have made, on average, $220 billion a year USD. That makes it one of the biggest black markets in the world, up there with drug trafficking, counterfeit goods, and potentially eclipsing human trafficking, depending on the estimates you're looking at, which really blew my mind. I had no idea just how lucrative the wildlife black market was. And needless to say, the illegal wildlife trade is extremely damaging to our environment, but I'm not going to get into that because it'll just make everybody sad, and it will probably make this video twice as long, so I put some links in the description if you want to learn more. Now, let us return to the 90s, where geoducks are popping off in Asia, and geoduck smuggling is popping off in Washington state. Enter the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, the government organization that handles all wildlife-related crimes within the great state of Washington. These are their stories. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. So detectives at the WDFW had started getting all sorts of outrageous tips about geoduck smugglers. One guy was selling the clams from the back of his Porsche. Another guy had made a deal to sell one last batch of geoducks outside of a courthouse right before he was sentenced to jail. This is when the detectives first started hearing about these clams being traded for drugs. And they knew there had to be some sort of head honcho running this network, a geoduck kingpin, if you will. And while these tips were helpful, getting information from someone on the inside would have been even more helpful. Meanwhile, a guy named Doug Tobin and his brother were interested in getting their scuba licenses because they wanted to get in on all the geoduck action. Side note, I can't find photos of any of the significant people in this story, so all notable individuals are going to be represented by some sort of marine animal, with a slight exception for Tobin. He was indigenous, he was of the Squaxin Island tribe, one of the indigenous nations that live around Puget Sound, and he was actually a very talented carver. He carved in the Coast Salish style, which is this 5,000-year-old art form that originated in the Pacific Northwest. And you might already be familiar with it. It's like this style. Anyway, given that Doug Tobin was Squaxin and a Coast Salish carver, I thought it'd be fun to have him be represented by a Coast Salish fish. So this is going to be Doug Tobin for the rest of the video. Side note to the side note, I fell down another rabbit hole learning about the Squaxin Island tribe because I found out that they have a long history of being connected to their local aquatic environments. So much so that they're also called the people of the water, which is so cool. If you want to learn more, I've put some links in the description, including this really amazing, virtual walking tour that goes through the history and culture of a subset of the Squaxin Island tribe called the Stachas, and it's really well done. And I also want to add that if you are Squaxin, if you're a person of the water, you are forever a guest of honor in my alien ocean. Anyway, so Tobin got his scuba license and started harvesting geoduck clams, and almost immediately he saw that many of his colleagues were completely ignoring all rules and regulations around geoducks. And this really bummed him out. So much so that he was complaining to a friend of his about all this, and his friend was like, "You'd make a pretty good informant, man. Maybe you should go hit up the cops." Now, why would he make a good informant? From what I read about him in Shell Games, Tobin could be both very charming and very intimidating. The chapter where Welch first talks about Doug Tobin is titled Larger Than Life, which sounded like a very apt descriptor for him.
Doug Tobin had always been big, but at 43, he was as dense and meaty as an aging pro wrestler. Doug was a charmer, a prankster, a benefactor, and a bully. He bought diapers for needy neighbors and Easter dresses for struggling single mothers' daughters, yet his teasing was merciless and sometimes bordered on cruel. As a kid, he talked friend Steve Saigo into getting plowed on hard liquor, and then for kicks told Saigo's father what his son had done. The man was funny and good-natured, a natural salesman and entrepreneur.
The detectives had to warm up to the idea, though, as informants apparently can be a pain to deal with. But after meeting with him, they changed their tune and brought Tobin on. All he had to do was become a geoduck smuggler himself and record all his conversations with other geoduck smugglers using a hidden mini tape recorder. Here's how the smuggling worked. All geoduck fishermen were given a daily quota of clams, but Tobin would harvest way more geoducks than he was allowed. He'd leave half of them in nets at the bottom of the sound and report and sell the other half through proper legal channels. Then he'd return at night and pull the unreported geoducks out of the water. These got boxed up in his garage and dropped off at the Seattle airport so they could be shipped cargo to wherever they needed to go. Tobin would get paid $5 for every pound of geoduck he smuggled, meaning he could make as much as $3,000 in a day's work, which is about $6,500 today. And who was sending Tobin this money? The geoduck kingpin, the man that the wildlife cops were hoping to capture because of Tobin going undercover. The cops didn't know a lot about the guy, except he had decent control over the geoduck market, and he didn't even live in Washington state. He lived in Las Vegas, Nevada. So given this, you'd think it would take a good amount of time before Tobin could speak directly with the great geoduck kingpin, right? Like he'd have to work his way through the network of smugglers, talk to dozens or even hundreds of different people, build rapport with those who are close to the top, and then hopefully get an in with the kingpin. This was going to be months or even years of work. Right? Nope. The very first time Tobin smuggled clams, he got a call from the geoduck kingpin the next day. Man was a smuggler for like 15 minutes and bam, instantly connected to the dude running the entire operation. Can you believe that? Lucky guy. Anyway, the kingpin had called up Tobin to yell at him because he had mislabeled the clams he sent, which could have gotten him in trouble with the feds. Turns out, the geoduck kingpin was a man named Nicholas P. DeCourville. I thought it'd be funny to put the face of Kingpin from Into the Spider-Verse on a geoduck, but this is making me uncomfortable. We're just going to use a king crab instead. And despite their rocky start, Tobin and DeCourville became fast friends, and he started sharing all sorts of information with Tobin.
Tobin learned that DeCourville connected fishermen with buyers, but that the goods never went through Las Vegas. DeCourville made a point of never actually touching the clams. That way he could distance himself from any crimes. If one of his suppliers actually got caught poaching, DeCourville could shrug and blame the reckless diver. DeCourville confided that he controlled 70% of the domestic geoduck market. He said he bought from a variety of sources and moved 2,000 pounds or more of clams per day. DeCourville bragged that he had so many illegal geoducks coming and going that even if authorities were paying attention, they could never track them all. He did not buy from just Tobin.
Months went by, and Tobin and the wildlife detectives kept gathering more and more evidence against DeCourville, while the kingpin remained confident that he was never going to get nabbed by the cops because the cops were too dumb. And then along came Casey Backer. Backer was another geoduck broker and had been in the industry for almost 2 decades at this point. Demand was still growing for geoducks, and Backer wanted a bigger piece of the clam pie. Gross. So he started offering geoduck divers an extra $2 an hour to sell only to him. This was a 40% raise compared to what DeCourville paid his scuba divers. And the next thing DeCourville knew, all his suppliers had completely bailed on him. Except for his dear friend and only loyal supplier, Doug Tobin, who listened to everything DeCourville had to say about his awful new business rival with a patient and empathetic ear, and it was during one of these conversations when DeCourville decided it was time to get rid of Backer permanently. He was going to hire a friend to plant a in Backer's truck. Tobin immediately told the wildlife detectives about this, but he had failed to record this conversation with his mini tape recorder, which was apparently a thing he did more often than he should have. So the detectives were like, you gotta get him talking about it again. You gotta get him talking about it again, man, and you gotta record it this time. When DeCourville finally did bring it up again, he had calmed down a little bit and walked back his desire to kill Backer with a Instead, he wanted to put an explosive in Backer's truck when Backer wasn't in it, and then, separately, his friend was going to break Backer's legs. And then he even walked that back and was like, just breaking his legs is fine. DeCourville wanted Tobin to help his friend, who DeCourville only called Rick. Rick was, ostensibly, a 300-pound ex-sheriff who lived in Los Angeles. DeCourville was going to fly him up to Washington, and then Tobin was supposed to meet up with him and point out Backer to him. That's all DeCourville wanted. Meanwhile, the wildlife cops were scrambling to find this guy so they could get to him before he got to Backer. Then one of the cops was like, "Hey Tobin, you should convince DeCourville that you'll do the job." And Tobin did just that. He called up DeCourville and explained that he had some friends coming into town who could help take care of this little problem. It only cost $5,000. DeCourville agreed and called off the other hitman. And once Tobin was wired the money, the cops decided it was time to move. A day later, police officers busted into DeCourville's house in Las Vegas and arrested him. He was apparently pretty chill while they searched his house, playing dumb and saying that he never bought stolen clams, until a federal agent mentioned Casey Backer's name and, quote,
DeCourville's demeanor changed so abruptly that several agents remarked on the shift in their notes.
The cops also ended up arresting a few other bit players in the criminal geoduck underworld, including a guy who was using all the profits he made selling stolen clams to build bombs. Like, when the police raided his house, it was just full of homemade explosives. One errant spark and the whole block would have been wiped off the face of the earth. And there's no real explanation why this guy was spending all his free time building explosives. I guess he was just really into bombs. Incidentally, the wildlife cops did eventually find that Rick guy, who DeCourville initially wanted to hire. They flew him to Washington to speak with him, and he arrived holding a teddy bear. Rick, full name Richard Jones, told the cops that he did agree to take care of Backer, but he mostly just said that to mess with DeCourville. He wasn't actually going to hurt anyone. He said he would do the job for $15,000, and DeCourville instantly balked. The cops sent Jones back to LA, but before he left, one officer did ask him, "What's with the teddy bear?" And Jones explained that his wife had died of cancer, and he missed her so much he couldn't sleep, so he'd curl up every night with the bear instead. And he took the bear everywhere, including on flights, because he had a terrible fear of flying. This was the hitman DeCourville originally tried to hire. Isn't this absurd? Doesn't it sound like something out of a movie? This doesn't even sound like that. No movie studio would make a film about the violent underground world of smuggling geoduck clams. Or if they did, they'd be cowards and change it from geoducks to, like, I don't know, regular clams or sharks or something, which would ruin everything, because so much of the absurdity comes from the fact that all this happened because of an animal that looks like this. In the end, DeCourville pled guilty to extortion and trafficking and was sentenced to 40 months in federal prison. Which, not gonna lie, was really disappointing to hear. And I could get into a whole rant about how stealing money from the rich will get you locked up for a lifetime, but when actual damage is done to actual people and the actual environment, our justice system doesn't care. But I haven't done enough research into this, and I know if I start talking about it, I'm gonna get all riled up and probably say things that aren't true, so I'm not gonna get on that soapbox. Anyway, I wish I could say that was the end of the story. I wish I could say that with DeCourville gone, geoduck poaching ceased entirely in Puget Sound, but this isn't the end of the story. I've only summarized about half of Welch's book, because once the geoduck kingpin was knocked down, another kingpin stepped in to take his place, and he was much, much worse. But I'm not gonna say how, because you really should go read this book. And if you don't have the money for it, see if your local library has it. That's where I got my copy. I have to take out all these sticky tabs before I return it, and that's going to be such a pain. But I will say that one of my gripes with the genre of true crime is that sometimes it's a genre that displays the suffering of others for our entertainment. And these aren't fictional characters who are suffering, these are real people. And yes, I will not deny that this story was extremely entertaining, but harm was done. Firstly, many poached geoducks were harvested from areas of Puget Sound where harmful algal blooms, or HABs, occurred. I've already talked about HABs in my dinoflagellates video, but long story short, some plankton that are poisonous will bloom in great numbers and then get consumed by filter feeders like mussels, oysters, and geoducks. The poison will build up in the filter feeder's body, and then when humans eat them, they get sick. Really sick. People have died from eating shellfish contaminated by poisonous plankton. Now, Washington state regulations make it clear that you cannot harvest geoducks from areas where HABs occur, but poachers don't care about that, and since most geoducks were sent illegally to Asia, there's no way of tracking how many people became ill or maybe even died. And I have no doubt that people became ill. With how many geoducks were being flown across the Pacific, it would have been a miracle if no one got sick. Secondly, millions of geoducks and millions of dollars were stolen from the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest. Okay, so I very briefly mentioned earlier that Puget Sound is partially managed by the Washington state government. They co-manage it with the indigenous tribes who live around the sound, some of whom depend, either economically or for subsistence, on harvesting shellfish. And legally, according to the treaties the U.S. government signed with these tribes, half of all fish and shellfish harvests from Puget Sound belong to them. But criminals like DeCorville were making millions of dollars off of geoducks, and not a single cent went to any Pacific Northwest nations. And this wasn't the first time money and resources that rightfully belonged to Pacific Northwest natives were taken from them, but it wasn't criminals stealing from them, it was the government. Although I say that as if it's shocking, like, breaking news, the United States stole stuff from Native Americans. Also, the sky is blue and water is wet. But like, stick with me, because I gotta tell you about this other rabbit hole I fell into. I fell into so many rabbit holes for this video, y'all. But this one was about the fish wars, which were a series of protests in the 1960s and 70s by Native Americans from the Pacific Northwest who were protesting for their fishing rights. At this point in time, Washington state was definitely not co-managing Puget Sound with local Native Americans, and had, in fact, passed laws making it illegal for indigenous people to fish off of their reservations, even though the treaties they signed said that Washington state wasn't allowed to do that. And many Native people had to fish off their reservations just to get food. So after dealing with this terrible treatment for decades, a bunch of indigenous people kicked off what's called the fish wars by doing things like fish-ins, which were modeled after the sit-ins that Black Americans were doing to protest segregation in the American South. Native Americans would set up camp in areas where they should have been allowed to fish and fished. And for the record, these weren't areas that were ecologically protected or anything like that. Non-native people and non-native commercial fishing companies would fish in these places all the time, and no one ever bothered them. It was just segregation, pure and simple. Also, get a load of this. Marlon Brando showed up to the fish-ins. Like, he was joining protests with the Puyallup Nation, and he wasn't there to just to gain clout. Like, he actually cared about their movement. I did not expect to be jump scared by Don Corleone when I was researching this video, I can tell you that much. Anyway, Washington state couldn't be having any of this, so they'd send the cops, including cops from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, to break up the camps, usually with unnecessary violence, and sometimes tear gas, and sometimes they'd injure children. But extremely long story short, it's because of these protests and other legal and political action that all these indigenous nations are now co-managers of Puget Sound and are entitled to half of all fish and shellfish harvests. And there's so much more I want to say about the fish wars, but I can't because I am already so behind schedule on this video. So once again, links in the description if you want to learn more. But special shout out in particular to this amazing video by Indigenous History Now that's all about the fish wars, along with these two documentaries, Back to the River and As Long as the Rivers Run, which is where I got most of the images and footage you've seen in this part of the video. Also, I made a donation to the makers of the Back to the River documentary. They're called Salmon Defense, and it's an organization founded by Native Americans of the Pacific Northwest, and they help protect local salmon populations and their habitats. And I think it's really important to support indigenous people who are working to protect and preserve the land and water that they've been living around for millennia, because no one knows their local environments better than they do. So I've linked to them down in the description if you'd like to make a donation as well. I am so off topic right now. The point I was trying to make is that geoduck poachers actively harmed the indigenous nations around Puget Sound by stealing resources and money that belonged to them, a pattern we've all seen repeat over and over and over again since colonizers first showed up in the Americas. And then finally, geoducks were harmed. So geoducks with nice, thick, white siphons would always fetch a much higher price than geoducks with small, dirty, gnarled ones, which many divers called hand grenades or footballs. The thing was, you didn't know what kind of geoduck you were going to get until you dug it up. Geoduck regulations required that all clams collected count towards a fisherman's quota, so if you met your quota and all you ended up was a big old pile of footballs, well, sucks to suck, man. But smugglers obviously didn't care about regulations, so they'd abandon lower grade geoducks on the seafloor for higher grade ones. This illegal practice, by the way, was called high grading. And if you've watched my previous video, you might be like, okay, what's the big deal there, Octopus lady? You said geoducks are burrowing clams, so they just rebury themselves, right? Wrong, actually. Geoducks lose the ability to bury themselves once they reach adulthood. Unknown numbers of these clams were left exposed on the seafloor and were subsequently eaten by predators. Additionally, the environment of Puget Sound must have been affected. Millions of tons of geoducks were removed from there, both legitimately and illegitimately, in a short amount of time. There's no way Puget Sound wasn't damaged in some capacity because of this. But what was very frustrating was I could barely find any papers on how Puget Sound was affected by the removal of geoducks. Honestly, Welch had the most to say about it in Shell Games, and he barely said anything.
Geoduck beds would take 39 years to recover, scientists estimated. And shallow water poaching near the shore jeopardized sensitive eelgrass beds that serve as aquatic nurseries for herring and endangered salmon.
Most papers about geoducks aren't really about the animals themselves or the role that they play in their ecosystem, but about how to farm them, which is important, I guess. You know, it's better that we're farming geoducks instead of collecting wild ones. But this felt analogous to... Okay, like, imagine I did research on how we cut down a bunch of old growth trees, and all I could find were papers about how to grow trees on a farm. And I'm over here like, y'all, what's happening out in the old growth forests? And all the papers are just like, farms! Which is... frustrating, but okay. From what I've gathered, there are potentially two ways Puget Sound was affected. Firstly, geoducks likely filter quite a bit of water every day and may suck enough plankton out of the water to help prevent harmful algal blooms. The loss of geoducks may have caused more HABs to occur. And secondly, geoducks might be benthic pelagic couplers, which are basically organisms that take nutrients that are out in open water and make them accessible to organisms that live on the sea floor. Go watch my video about brittle stars if you want to learn the details, but without geoducks, I do wonder if nutrient levels along the floor of Puget Sound dropped in areas where these clams were harvested. I don't know if any of this is true, though. This is just speculation from me and from what little I know about geoducks. What I feel has to be true, though, is that Puget Sound was affected in some unspecified way because of the loss of these clams. Every single time we take too much from nature, bad things happen, whether it's old growth trees or bison or New England cod. There's no way geoducks would be an exception here. We really need to do more research into this. I can't believe there isn't research already done on this. So to wrap things up, why did geoducks cause such chaos? It's because they simply existed. When I was making these videos, I couldn't stop thinking about how these clams are arguably the least interesting organism on my channel. I mean, they look weird, of course, but they don't do anything? They spend their whole lives just sitting in sand mud and mud sand. They're not like sea cucumbers who vomit up all their organs, or sacoglossan slugs who rip their heads off their own bodies, or pufferfish who do this, or moray eels who have two sets of jaws, or dinoflagellates who have stupid amounts of DNA for completely inexplicable reasons. And yet, no other organism on my channel has caused humans to build elaborate smuggling networks. These clams made people greedy and violent and gluttonous through no fault of their own. They were just there. It was just this persistent reminder that sometimes the least interesting things can make humans do the wildest stuff. Now, you may have noticed that there were points in this video where I had to censor certain words, like and this is because my last video got demonetized for containing adult content, even though it didn't. YouTube just thought it did because of, well, how geoducks look. Now, I've been assured that YouTube won't demonetize this video for that reason, but I'm concerned that they might demonetize it for talking about violent events, even though I don't show anything violent on screen. Still, I don't want to take any chances, so if you want to watch an uncensored version, there's only one place you can see it, and that's over on my streaming service, Nebula. Nebula is a prestige streaming platform where you can watch thousands of thoughtful, well-made videos by our hundreds of talented content creators. We have no ads, no manipulative algorithms, and we're actually chill with saying words like and so you can watch my video without any annoying distractions. And while you're there, you can check out some of our other amazing creators, like Joe Scott, who just so happens to have his own Nebula original series called Mysteries of the Human Body. Nebula Originals are videos that you can only watch on Nebula, and I recommend his episode titled 6 Weird Diseases That Leave Scientists Scratching Their Heads. In it, Joe talks about prion diseases like Kuru, which affects the brain and causes loss of motor control, genetic diseases like progeria, which causes rapid premature aging, and Morgellons disease, which I really don't want to describe here because it really grossed me out. And if weird, unsettling diseases don't interest you, you can check out our other Nebula originals like Tearzu's Let's Play Outside, Wendover Productions' The Logistics of X, and Real Science's Becoming Human. Right now, you can use my link, nebula.tv/theoctopuslady, to get 40% off an annual subscription, which will cost you only about $3 a month. Or you can sign up for a lifetime subscription, which means you only have to pay $300 once, and then you have access to Nebula forever. This is a great way to support me and a ton of other creators like me, plus you get access to exclusive and/or uncensored content and a top-tier streaming experience. So head on over to nebula.tv/theoctopuslady, or scan this QR code, or go check out my link in the description to sign up for Nebula and experience all the awesome content we have to offer. And with that, thanks for watching another episode of Alien Ocean. And oh my goodness, y'all, this one was rough. I didn't know if I was ever going to be able to finish it. I could have easily made entirely separate individual videos about wildlife trafficking, the Squaxin Island tribe, the fish wars, and the treaties between indigenous nations and the United States government. I fell into that rabbit hole when I was researching the fish wars, but I had to cut that part out due to time and not being able to do the topic justice. But I could probably make a whole video about Native American treaties if I wanted to. I don't want to, though, because researching humans is too hard. I don't like it. Nothing ever happens in a void with you people. One group of humans will do something that affects another group of humans, so they do something, and that affects another group of humans, so they do something, and you gotta research all of them, otherwise you're not gonna get the full story, and it just goes on and on and on. It's endless. I'm never putting this much effort into studying humans again. Y'all be doing too much. It's exhausting. Anyway, I got a question for everyone. Remember that guy who was using all his geoduck money to build bombs? Well, if you were making that ill-gotten clam cash, what would you buy with it? And it's gotta be something weird. Don't be responsible and spend it on your rent or anything, because that's boring. So leave your answer down in the comments. Shout out to Curious Archive for reading all the Shell Game quotes. I really appreciate him taking the time to do that. His channel is linked in the description, so check out his amazing videos if you haven't already. And special shout out, as always, to my patrons. Thank you so much for all your support. If you'd like to support me, you can sign up for my Patreon over at patreon.com/theoctopuslady, where you can get early access to my videos and/or your name in the beautiful credits. You can also follow me over on Blue Sky. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood octopus lady, reminding you that you don't have to go into space to find aliens.